What is going on, everybody? James Hancock here. I'm back today to discuss a topic that has basically been my favorite topic of conversation since I was a little boy, the fantasy genre. More specifically, which fantasy series are out there or remain out there that have never been adapted as shows and movies that might be strong contenders as we move into the future. And a couple of months ago, I probably wouldn't have made this video because I had basically had the attitude I don't want Hollywood ever to touch anything that I like ever again, because over the last couple of years we've seen a lot of fantasy series like The Witcher or The Wheel of Time or Lord of the Rings of Power. Like, we've seen so many great fantasy series or fantasy franchises just utterly butchered and ruined and just run right into the ground by hacks and lesser talents. However, there's a small glimmer of hope out there right now called A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, where HBO, by some miracle, has managed to more or less adapt the novella, The Hedge Knight, into a really cool series. And all it takes is just a little glimmer of hope before I allow myself to get excited about the future again. So what I'm going to do today is basically a broad overview of all the fantasy series out there, which I think might be strong contenders for either shows or movies. But here's the thing. Every time I tackle the fantasy genre on this channel, thanks to all the commenters out there, I get tons of recommendations and suggestions for books that I've never read. So much so that, like, my stack of fantasy books to be read probably exceeds the fantasy books that I have read at this point, and I've been reading the fantasy genre for decades. I don't know when I'm going to find time for all these fucking books, but I'm going to break this video into three different categories. The opening is going to be all the books that have been recommended to me that I've bought that I've not yet read, just so that people in the comments won't say, have you read the following yet? I'm like, no, but I'm at least acknowledging that I have it in my hand. It's on my shelf waiting to be read. The next section is going to be fantasy series that are either still ongoing, that are still being published, so we don't quite know if they'll shit the bed or if they'll get even better or whatever the case might be, or fantasy series where I've only read fragments, like a few short stories or one or two books in a given series. But basically, I've got like a working knowledge but not a complete understanding. But then the end of the video is going to be the big section, the most important section, fantasy series where basically I've read everything there is to be read on a given topic, where I've got a big full-throated recommendation where I feel like they might be incredible shows and movies. So pick your poison. So this first section is basically dedicated to all of you. All the people who have been kind enough to support this channel over the years, but more importantly, kind enough to leave recommendations and suggestions anytime the fantasy genre comes up. So let's start with one of the big ones that probably gets recommended more than any other. The Book of the New Sun series, aka Shadow and Claw by Gene Wolfe. I believe this is either two novellas or two novels or three, all combined into one. I've heard a lot of recommendations, and so this one's at the top of my list. Here's one I know nothing about, The Ember Blade by Chris Wooding. One of you recommended it to me, and I bought it off Amazon. Here's another that gets tons of recommendations, Kings of the Wild by Nicholas Eames. One of my big blind spots in the fantasy genre is author John Gwynne. And what I like about the fantasy genre is how there's so many authors out there right now who remain active, that are cranking out tons of books. I feel like it's a very good time to be a fan of the fantasy genre. So these are the first books in two separate series that are unrelated, Malice and Shadow of the Gods. This one gets recommended very highly, and the cover art is fucking killer, so I'm very inclined to dig into him. But for people out there who like Joe Abercrombie or R. Scott Baker or any of the big fantasy authors that are active right now, yeah, John Gwynne keeps coming up. I don't even know if this is fantasy, but Between Two Fires, I think it's either like dark, like the Dark Ages and like the medieval times, or it's got a little bit of fantasy, but this apparently is killer. For all the literature buffs, a little Russian fiction, Master and Margarita, or The Master and Margarita by Mikhail Bulgakov. I think this came out like in the late 50s or early 60s, but apparently it's one of the best novels of the 20th century with a lot of fantasy ingredients. But yeah, if I were to put one book at the top of the list, maybe this one should be it. A major closet embarrassment of mine is that I've never read any of Clark Ashton Smith. My buddy Victor Rodriguez, I know he's a big fan of his work, but there's certain fantasy authors who were just part of the foundation of the fantasy genre becoming so popular in the 20th century, and he's definitely one of them. Here's another one that comes up all the time, The Black Prism by Brent Weeks. Here's a good one. When I had the filmmakers behind the fantasy movie, the Spine of Night on this channel a couple of years ago, I asked them, like, what are the obscure fantasy series out there that you would really recommend that people perhaps have not have heard of? And they recommended Carl Edward Wagner's Gods and Darkness, the complete novels of Cain. The cover art is by, I believe, Frank Frazetta. Looks fucking killer. Looks right up my alley. Here's a big one. So Ursula K. Le Guin, I think of her more as an author from science fiction with books like The Left Hand of Darkness. But the books of the Earthsea, you could bludgeon someone to death with this. That's the big problem with all these fantasy series. They're so fucking long. But to be fair, I think this is like several novels all in one. But Stephen Saunders, who I've recorded a lot of podcasts with, he recommended this. I'm like, all right, one day when I'm in the hospital getting like my gallbladder removed, maybe I'll crack this fucker open. But I've at least read some Ursula K. Le Guin, just not any of her fantasy. And here's a funny one. Tad Williams, The Dragonbone Chair. It's been recommended to me so many times. I actually have 2 copies of the book. I like this kind of old school bestseller format much more than like these big old tomes. But I've got another copy on my bookshelf in the back room. But anyway, enough people have recommended it where I've got 2 copies. So one of these days I'll crack it open. Glenn Cook's The Black Company. This one's probably been recommended 20 or 30 times on the channel, and I think it's one of the big major fantasy series of the 80s that kind of led into the emergence of the grimdark movement in the 1990s. And everybody defines grimdark a little differently and who are the main authors, but obviously George R. R. Martin started writing his Song of Ice and Fire in the 1990s, and that was like what really helped popularize grimdark. But apparently before George R. R. Martin kind of made things popular with Game of Thrones, The Black Company got there first. Scott Lynch's The Lies of Locke Lamora. I actually started this years ago and for whatever reason got distracted and put it down. But it's basically a lot of devilish rogues and charming scalawags who are indulging in a series of heists and so on and so forth. But I definitely need to crack this bad boy back open. David Gemmell, Legend. This one's been recommended more times than I can count on this channel. But anyway, I think I might have even started this one as well. But I have a bad habit of starting, having a couple different books that I'm working on at once, and then setting books aside when I find one that I really like. Right now, what I'm reading is Vision Quest, which is about high school wrestling. I usually have a palate cleanser in between fantasy books so that the next fantasy book will feel fresh and exciting. So high school wrestling's got my full attention right now. The last recommendation is a retelling of the Arthurian legends by Bernard Cornwell. And I'm embarrassed to admit, this guy's written like 150,000 books. I have never read one. The Last Kingdom, that show about Vikings in the UK, that was based on some of his books. But this guy's been writing historical fiction for many, many years. But he claims this retelling of the Arthurian legends is the favorite thing that he's ever written. So I feel like if I'm going to read at least one series by Bernard Cornwell, it should be the series that he highly recommends. So those are all the books that remain on my must-read list. If you have a suggestion that I did not just present to you, by all means leave it in the comments below. But I just remembered that there's yet another author that I should have included in this section, and that is Brandon Sanderson, where I've read 3 of his books, but the 3 books by him that I read were the end of the Wheel of Time series, because for people who don't know, Robert Jordan, who wrote The Wheel of Time, he died before finishing it. So Brandon Sanderson stepped in and completed it for him in very satisfying fashion. Like, is it exactly how Robert Jordan would have done it? Who knows? But Brandon Sanderson, he also has his own series, but I don't need to recommend them on this video because he already got the green light recently to turn a lot of his books into shows and movies, courtesy of Apple. And here are the 2 big series that I need to read. I've never read any of Mistborn. I started The Way of Kings and for whatever reason got sidetracked, but there are a lot of diehard fantasy fanatics and even also a lot of casual fantasy fans who really love the Stormlight Archive series. And so before those shows and movies reach either the big or small screen, at a minimum, I will read the first books in all the series just to make sure that I'm up to speed. But Brandon Sanderson, he sold like 50 million books at this point. He doesn't need any help from this channel. But now we're going to move into the next section where I've either read a couple of short stories or a couple novels in a given series, but have no idea if they go up or down or stay the same. But I've read enough where I'm encouraged by them where I feel like they might actually make good shows and movies. And let's start with one series that might not ever be finished, where I've read the first book, but I'm reluctant to read the second because I don't know if the third's coming. And it's just so heartbreaking when a fantasy series is not finished. But Patrick Rothfuss, The Name of the Wind, a.k.a. the King Killer Chronicle, which has remained in development hell for more than a decade. At one point, Sam Raimi was attached to bring it to the screen, but here's the second book, which I have not read, but here's excellent, The Wise Man's Fear. 2 of my brothers have read it. They highly recommend it, but once again, it's like, do I really want to read a 950-page or 970-page book where I won't know how it's going to end because Patrick Rothfuss he has struck a reef. Either he's too distracted with his side quests, or he's lost interest. I've heard even reports that he wrote the third book and scrapped it because he thought it wasn't good enough. But The Name of the Wind, the first book, fucking rules. This is one of those big old fantasy tomes where I just couldn't put it down. And the short version would be, or the short version of the pitch would be, you've got a total badass who's basically looking back on some of the key chapters of his life. And in the first book, you basically get, what if there were a Harry Potter series out there, but written with an adult sensibility? And that's not a knock on J.K. Rowling and the kind of the more innocent sensibility of her 7 books in the Harry Potter series. But The Name of the Wind is just a little rougher, a little tougher. It's brilliantly written. It's incredibly thrilling. And everybody loves reading either a fantasy or a sci-fi series where somebody goes from knowing nothing to becoming incredibly talented and incredibly brilliant and showing all this potential. The Name of the Wind fucking rules. And if I ever hear like a wisp of a rumor that the third book is coming, well then, The Wise Man's Fear will be first on my must-read list. And while we're on the subject of fantasy series that might not ever be finished, let's talk a little bit about George R. R. Martin, because he's got 3 separate ongoing series all set on Westeros, none of which will probably ever be finished. I've read all those books, so technically I have finished the series, but Song of Ice and Fire technically has 2 more books to come. Fire and Blood has a 2nd book on the way, and A Night of the Seven Kingdoms has a 4th and 5th novella that are all due. I don't think we'll ever see any of them, but Fire and Blood... The first big chunk of this book deals with the character of Aegon the Conqueror, and apparently HBO has a series in development, but not with a green light, to adapt the story of Aegon the Conqueror and his 2 sisters as they conquered Westeros. And it would be a pretty killer series. The big challenge would be, it's written like a history, and so how do you adapt like a story written in broad strokes? How do you flesh out all the details? Because as we've seen with House of the Dragon, adapting the Dance of the Dragons, which takes place about 2/3 of the way through Fire and Blood, if there's a lot of unknown space on the map in terms of the story, it gives writers a lot of room to hang themselves with. But I do love the story of Aegon the Conqueror. At a minimum, read Fire and Blood just to get the full story. But I would like to see an Aegon the Conqueror show, but only if it could be adapted as thoroughly and as well and as satisfactorily as A Night of the Seven Kingdoms. While we're on the subject of fantasy series that are already in development, Joe Abercrombie published this book last year called The Devils, and it's already been acquired by Lightstorm Entertainment, which is the company owned and run by James Cameron. And the big question is, will James Cameron make Avatar movies until the day he dies, or will he explore a few other topics? Like, I, for one, would vote, go ahead and adapt The Devils and do the best that you can, because we've never seen James Cameron tackle fantasy. We've seen a lot of science fiction from James Cameron. He does science fiction, or at least once upon a time, he did science fiction in a way that I like to consume it. But with The Devils, the short version of the pitch would be, imagine The Dirty Dozen, but set in a medieval Europe where a lot of fantasy ingredients are true. And it's a different Europe from our own history, where some of the major wars from our own history, they had different outcomes, but also you have elves and vampires and werewolves and all these supernatural creatures. But people love movies like The Suicide Squad and stuff like that, where you have a lot of people going on a mission where not all of them are going to make it to the end. Same holds true with The Devils. They put together a team of some pretty hardcore, savage individuals who are more or less doing this mission against their will, and not all of them are going to make it to the final page. But at a minimum, I believe Joe Abercrombie has a 2nd and a 3rd book coming our way, and we'll be talking about the First Law series later in this video, but in that I was so satisfied by the First Law series. I'm dying to see more books set in the Devil's universe. Now, for my next recommendation, I've only read 2 books in this series, but I think there are like 18 or 19 books in this series at this point, so I'm going to be deferring to the wisdom and the judgment and the taste of one of my younger brothers, who I think has read nearly all of them. But I'm going to talk about the Dresden Files. I have read Stormfront and Full Moon, and I've got Grave Peril on my to-do list. And apparently Grave Peril is where the series really kicks into high gear, but I really like the first 2 books. To be fair, they already attempted a show almost 20 years ago. They did 1 season. All I've seen is the intro, and I'm like, all right, somebody took a stab at it. But my understanding is that, well, let me first give the pitch. It's basically a dark adult fantasy setting in Chicago, where you have somebody who is like a Philip Marlowe character, but he happens to be a sorcerer, spellcaster, wizard, necromancer, whatever you want to call him. He knows a thing or two about the supernatural and about magic. And it's clear in the context, at least of the first two books, that there are a lot of dark forces on the horizon that are rising, and the status quo of the world is about to be shaken up considerably. But it's an interesting combination of contemporary kind of like hard-boiled like pulp fiction combined with supernatural fantasy and that sort of thing. So yeah, my little brother says that the books just keep getting better and better. And I even heard a rumor at one point that one of the reasons that Patrick Rothfuss is struggling so hard or struggling so badly with finishing the Kingkiller Chronicle is that he's so addicted to the Dresden Files, he just keeps rereading them. I'm like, no, that sounds like a bunch of bullshit. It is possible to read books and write books at the same time, or walk and chew gum at the same time. But if you like just watching a kind of an unsavory character navigating the world of supernatural creatures in Chicago and solving crimes and mysteries, well, it's a killer series. I'm going to read more of it, but I think it would make an excellent ongoing TV show. And I'm not quite sure what the numbers were on the original attempt, but clearly the numbers weren't strong enough for a season 2. Now, one of my biggest sources of shame and embarrassment when it comes to the fantasy genre is that I've not read more of Fritz Leiber's stories featuring the character of Fafford and the Grey Mouser. I've read 3 of his short stories, which are contained in this collection. I've got a second collection ready to go. And you know what? I think, yes, Fafford and the Grey Mouser, book 2. But the reality is, the story Ill-Met at Lankmar, which came out, I think, I'm seeing here online that it was first published in April of 1970 in the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction, and then later appeared in the 1970 collection Swords and Devilry, which is precisely the collection that I have here. But Ill-Met at Lankmar, oh my God, it is the full package. First and foremost, it's short, and we live in a time where everybody's got short attention spans, so if you've got a short attention span and you don't want to commit to a 10,000-page fantasy series, Ill-Met at Lankmar, it doesn't introduce you to these characters because they've already been introduced separately in prior stories, but it might as well serve as an introduction. But Fafford and the Grey Mouser, I first encountered them in Deities and Demigods, or Deities and Demigods. I've never quite known how to say it, but it's a D&D like compendium of all these different characters, basically all the stats for different characters from myth and legend and other sources of fiction. And as a little kid, I went over their bio and their stats many times over. And then in my 20s, I finally read Ill-Met at Lankmar. And what I like about it is how it is like great heroic fantasy, but it's also really gnarly and dark. It seems to be borrowing from and inspired heavily by Robert E. Howard and some of his darker fantasy stories featuring Conan. And I always like fantasy that leans into and wraps its arms around the darkest ingredients within the fantasy genre, because the story starts out so happy-go-lucky with these 2 adventurers getting drunk and hanging out with their girlfriends and boasting of all their great deeds, and then they basically go on a heist. The heist kind of goes well, but it has horrible consequences, and then they have to go on a revenge mission. It is so fucking good. In that I loved it so much, I should probably read more Fritz Leiber's stories as opposed to just rereading Ill-Met at Lankmar. So y'all tell me, what are the definitive Fafford and Grey Mouser stories? But in that, he wrote so many short stories featuring these characters. You could easily have 5 or 6 seasons of a fantasy adventure featuring these 2 characters. So maybe one day we will see it reach either the big or small screen. Now, the next series is one where I've read quite a bit of the available material, but at a certain point, author Michael Moorcock decided to go back and start telling flashback stories, because we're talking about Elric of Melniboné. I bought this collection, Stealer of Souls, years ago. Fucking loved it. And it's basically a collection of all the novellas and short stories that make up the original arc of the character of Elric of Melniboné. And it does have like a very satisfactory conclusion, but the character is so popular, it's been ripped off and copied so many times. At a certain point, Michael Moorcock was like, all right, you like this character? Let me give you more. So I've got book 2 coming up, Stormbringer, which is the flashback story. It's a whopper, as you can see. I'm dying to read it because I do love the character. And speaking of the character, he might be the most often imitated character in fantasy, apart from perhaps Conan the Barbarian. Because whether you're talking about The Witcher, or Raistlin from the Dragonlance series, or even a lot of the Targaryens from George R. Martin, anytime you see a character who's like an albino with like white hair and like funky eyes with like, forbidden knowledge of magic, That is basically a ripoff of Elric of Melniboné. And what I've always found so fascinating about Elric is how he has knowledge of magic that it places such physical demands upon his body that he can't cast those spells. He's got a very frail constitution, but he has the at least like the understanding of magic that is beyond his ability to control. But what makes him a hell on wheels in combat is he has this fucking sword who's got basically a mind of his own that likes eating souls. And anytime he doesn't feed it enough or on enough of a regular basis, well, then it starts to react in horrible ways. And that would be directly ripped off and loosely would inspire Jim Starlin in his approach to the character of Adam Warlock and the Soul Gem, where if that character in Marvel Comics didn't give it enough souls, well, then it would find a way to get fed one way or another. But if you were to read one story featuring the character, The Dreaming City, which appeared, in Science Fantasy number 47 in June of 1961. That, like Ilmet at Lankmar, is one of my favorite short stories in the fantasy genre, where it introduces the character, gives you a fucking ferocious adventure and awesome battles with high stakes and high drama and awesome consequences, where you're like, all right, I'm going to read 50 more stories featuring this character. So I love this collection. At a certain point, I will dust off the character and dive back in. But if you wanted to make a series of shows and movies featuring Elric of Melniboné, yeah, I would be first in line to buy a ticket. Now, the last series I want to discuss in this section, where I've read a couple of the books, but still have a very long way to go, is a series called, I've been calling it Malazan Book of the Fallen for years, but apparently the author, Steven Erikson, emphasizes the second name, like Malazan Book of the Fallen. That sounds weird, but I was listening to some videos last night about this series, and anyway, I've been mispronouncing it for a long time, which should come as a surprise to nobody. But I've read the first three, all of which are whoppers, all which are fascinating. But I regard this fantasy series as like one of the great kind of foreboding Herculean challenges that remains on my to-do list, because the books are a little bit tough to read. When I read Gardens of the Moon, the first book, which I loved, but I read it and had a glossary and had the internet open, because every time I encountered a character or a word or phrase I didn't understand, I would try to get a little deeper understanding. And I found myself actually spending more time reading the glossary and the appendices as opposed to the book itself. But it is slow going at first, because sometimes people describe this series as the Dark Souls of fantasy series. And what do they mean by that? They mean no hand-holding, where the author is like, you know what? I've invented this vast, complex world of warring empires with all these different races and gods and, ascended beings and so on and so forth, and you just gotta keep up, or I'm just gonna leave you behind. So it's like, it's a little bit like, like some old Greek myth where like you're pushing a boulder up to the top of the hill, but like in that Greek myth, you get to the end of the Gardens of the Moon and the boulder rolls back down, because in the second book, which is even better, Deadhouse Gates, you basically got to start over with a whole new cast of characters apart from one or two. And you're like, no, like I just started to understand what was happening. And now you're making me kind of, rediscover this world all over again. And the reason that happened, apparently back in the day in the 90s when he was writing the second book, he'd lost his first draft of the second book, which was like 350 pages. And he didn't have the heart to start rewriting it because it was so good. And that was the story that ultimately would become Memories of Ice. So as a way of kind of cleansing his palate and giving himself a fresh start, he switched gears and went and wrote Deadhouse Gates. But as a reader, it makes it very hard to get through the first two books, where it's just a constant uphill battle. But if you're willing to put in the effort and you're willing to put in the time, it's probably the richest, most complex, most detail-oriented, fully fleshed out fantasy universe ever created by any individual writer, where I believe in the main series there's 10 books, but then there's like other spin-off series. It can keep you busy for a very long time. And I've got the fourth book, House of Chains, ready to rock, and it's been on my to-do list for a couple of years now, just waiting to be read. The main reason I've not yet started is that anytime I look up people's lists of their favorite books in this series, they always seem to say that books 2 and 3 are the best. I'm like, well, if I've already read the best that the series has to offer, it makes it very hard to get motivated to keep going. But at a certain point, I will dive into House of Chains, because I relish the challenge of diving into a world with a huge history, with its own lore, with its own magic system. It's like, for people who like a lot of detail in their fantasy, it is the absolute, it's the Shangri-La, it's the El Dorado of the fantasy genre, and I owe it to myself as a fan of the genre to keep going. But if somebody wanted to turn it into a series or a series of movies, I mean, good luck, because Gardens of the Moon, this could be like 3 or 4 seasons of TV just all on its own. I don't know how you would do it. Maybe just like somebody could do like a great series of audiobooks with like animation playing as somebody reads it. I don't know how you would adapt it, but I definitely needed to include it on this list because there are some people out there who they know wherever they speak. A lot of people say it's the best fantasy series ever written. So you tell me, what do y'all think about the Malazan Book of the Fallen, or Malazan Book of the Fallen, however the hell you pronounce that title? All right, it's time to move into the section of the video where my knowledge of the books or series in question is more or less complete, and we're going to start with the very first fantasy series that I ever read. And I got to be very delicate as I pick these up because I've had them since I was 10 years old. About the Dragonlance Chronicles, Dragons of Autumn Twilight, Dragons of Winter Night, Dragons of Spring Dawning. And if you breathe on these, they will fall to pieces. And the follow-up trilogy, the Legends series, Time of the Twins, War of the Twins, and Test of the Twins. Yeah, a lot of similar titles. But holy crap, this is basically what ignited my obsession with the fantasy genre, because I was already playing D&D at this time, but these were D&D tie-ins launching the Dragonlance campaign. And I've reread these books in subsequent years, and they definitely are better to be read when you're younger, but if you can appreciate them as an adult, like the character of Raceland, he's one of my all-time favorite characters in fantasy literature, but I'm glad I read them for the first time when I was 10. There was an animated series with Kiefer Sutherland doing the voice for Raceland at one point, but people have talked for a million years about trying to do Dragonlance. I know that Joe Manganiello, if I'm saying his name correctly, I know he even wrote like a TV pitch at one point trying to sell. He said it was the best thing he ever wrote. I've never read any of his stuff he ever, but he's a Dragonlance fanatic or savant, and who knows if they'll ever do it. And Tracy Hickman and Margaret Weiss, they've gone on to write a bunch of other books in the Dragonlance series, and there are a million other authors who contributed to the Dragonlance setting, like Richard A. Knack with The Legend of Huma, which is fills in the kind of the backstory or the history of the world as well. But I love Dragonlance. It was fucking killer. My Dragonlance, whoa. The D&D book for the campaign setting, right here, which came out in the late 80s, which I fucking loved. If you're a D&D fan, you'll recognize that cover by Jeff Easley. But I don't know if anybody will ever... I feel like it's been around for so long that if it were going to happen, it probably would have already happened. And so maybe it's better if it just remains like something for D&D fans from the 1980s. But at a minimum, I just felt like I had to give it a shout out because when I was a little boy, that's what got me, kind of set me down the path of being obsessed with the fantasy genre. But that led me to The Eyes of the Dragon by Stephen King, which I've read twice. And if you just want a standalone fantasy book, where you don't have to commit to, 10 books that are 1,000-page in length and that sort of thing. Because I think a lot of times that's like the biggest barrier to entry. People are like, I don't want to commit the next decade of my life to reading these fucking books. But the story I heard was that Stephen King's daughter in the 80s, like, can't you write something for once that I can read that's not, about vampires or girls with telekinesis killing everybody or the end of the world or whatever the case may be? He's like, sure. Because Stephen King loves The Lord of the Rings. And basically, the Dark Tower series is his Lord of the Rings. And people have tried to adapt bits and pieces of the Dark Tower series. I don't even know if that's even possible to be adapted. But you can see, is it up here? No, it's in the other room. I've got the gunslinger and the drawing of the three and all that stuff. But The Eyes of the Dragon would just be a dynamite movie because, first and foremost, my favorite villain in all of Stephen King's shared universe is the character of Flag. And this is probably the best version of Flag as an outright villain that I've come across, but obviously he's fantastic in, oh my God, pulling a brain fart, The Stand, Jesus. Yeah, I read The Stand many years ago, which is fucking killer, but people might be asking, what does a dystopian sci-fi book about the end of the world have to do with the fantasy book? Well, then you should read both The Stand and The Eyes of the Dragon to find out. But there's a lot of connective tissue running between all of Stephen King's books. But The Eyes of the Dragon is not entirely for kids, if memory serves. It's some pretty overt sexuality early on in the story, but it's got some fantastic illustrations. But I feel like, Stephen King, in the last 50 years, no writer has launched more shows and movies with their ideas than Stephen King. Like, there are some authors who, have like a big series like J.K. Rowling, but look at Stephen King's IMDb page and see just how many shows and movies have been adapted from his material. It's fucking crazy. But The Eyes of the Dragon has never been touched, and it's from Stephen King in his prime period, so that's definitely worthy of being adapted if somebody could do it properly. But I just remembered yet another fantasy series related to Dungeons & Dragons and the books that fleshed out some of the various campaign settings set within Dungeons & Dragons. I got to give a shout out to Dark Sun, because Dark Sun, I think actually the campaign setting for Dark Sun is actually more interesting than the books. But the books are pretty goddamn good, or at least when I was a senior in high school, I thought they were pretty goddamn good because back then I ran a Dark Sun campaign my senior year of high school. And then 3 years ago, I dipped back into the world of Dark Sun. And for like a year and a quarter, I ran a Dark Sun campaign for adults. And we had so much fucking fun. But the short version of Dark Sun is basically it's like the Shattered Lands, where it's a world where anytime you cast a spell, it absorbs life from the planet, which is why the whole world is like this fucked up, horrible desert wasteland. But it's also very reminiscent of kind of the Roman Empire, where you've got all these various city-states that are ruled over by these corrupt sorcerer kings who are all turning into dragons slowly. And it's a lot of like gladiatorial combat and civil wars and all kinds of crazy shit. But as a fantasy series, yeah, there were 5 books in the original series, which were pretty goddamn good. But if you're a fan of D&D, you owe it to yourself to play Dark Sun with the 2nd edition rule set. And it leads into, hang on, high-level gameplay for character levels 20 to 30. This is where it gets really good when characters start turning into elementals and dragons and Evangians and all kinds of crazy shit. But there are some people who are reluctant to allow their campaigns to get but so high level. But for people who just don't want their campaigns to end, Dark Sun, specifically the Dragon King's rulebook, allows your campaigns basically to go indefinitely. But as much as I might love the Dragonlance series and as much as I might love The Eyes of the Dragon, let's set aside the books of my childhood and talk about a series that I read very recently as a mean old man. I'm talking about Empire of the Vampire by Jay Kristoff, which is followed by Empire of the Damned, which is followed by the best book in the series, Empire of the Dawn, which I reviewed on this channel last year, and I'll leave a link to that review in the description below. But Jay Kristoff is wildly talented, and he's got a bunch of other books out there which I've not yet read. But the pitch for Empire of the Vampire would be, imagine a dark adult fantasy setting where basically the forces of good have lost, and you have all these warring empires of different bloodlines of vampires that are basically fighting over the scraps of what remains. And you've got a few little pockets of humanity that are left that are just barely hanging on. But the last of the Silver Saints, Gabriel de Leon, which is basically like a holy knight, but even though he's not that holy, he cusses a lot, he screws a lot, he drinks a lot. He's kind of a gnarly dude, but he's covered in all these silver tattoos which gleam when he's fighting the undead, which makes the undead kind of recoil. And he's got a talking sword named Ash Drinker, which is very similar, or at least inspired by the sword that Elric of Melniboné wields in those Michael Moorcock stories. But basically, Gabriel de Leon, he's been captured, he's been imprisoned, and there's a vampire historian who says, the Empress wants to hear your story. And he starts telling his story in Empire of the Vampire. And then in Empire of the Damned, it's 2 different narrators, and then they all kind of come together in Empire of the Dawn. But I like the fact that it's a self-contained trilogy where I don't have to worry about waiting for like more books to come out. If you just want a kick-ass trilogy, I would recommend also a palate cleanser in between the books. Don't read them all in one fell swoop. Read some crime fiction or a story about high school wrestling or whatever in between so that they continue to feel fresh and exciting. But if you like your fantasy to be a little bit more vulgar and gory, a lot of screwing and gore and just like really gnarly, visceral, kind of viscous fluids and that sort of thing, it's very satisfying. It's also very irreverent. And if you're looking for kind of classic, kind of high fantasy, it's not going to satisfy you because a lot of the dialogue sounds very contemporary. But if you just want to see characters that resemble badasses from like anime, like Vampire Hunter D, going to war and beating the fuck out of each other, this series will absolutely delight you. And I think it would make a killer TV show and or series of movies if anybody could adapt it with even an ounce of integrity, because let's just say that the show or movie would have to show a lot of courage and be willing to deal with a lot of pushback due to the frank depictions of certain situations. So who knows? But at a minimum, everybody should buy that trilogy, take it for a spin. So now that I've shown a little love and affection to the work of Jay Kristoff, let's talk about one of his peers or one of his pals that he's gone on tour with and done a lot of interviews with, and I'm talking about Joe Abercrombie. And I mentioned him earlier when discussing his recent book, The Devils, but the big Joe Abercrombie series is First Law, which starts with the blade itself, which is not the strongest of the series, but it's good enough where it'll get its hooks into you. Here's the good news. The series continues to get better and better and better as it goes, and I would argue that it peaks with the center trilogy of these standalone novels, Best Served Cold, The Heroes, and Red Country. And I know a lot of morons out there say, oh, well, they're standalone books. I can just skip those. And they dive right into the Age of Madness trilogy, which comes after. Don't do that. All the characters that are introduced in the first three, they continue their stories in the standalone books. I won't mention which prominent YouTuber made that mistake, but they were offering that poor advice for years, and my younger brother followed that poor advice. He's like, what do you mean? Like those books don't even count. They absolutely count. They're the best in the series. But anyway, it's one of my bones to pick in the world of fantasy book commentary. But how can I describe the First Law series? I would say it's an ongoing series of battles between civilization and savagery, as a lot of new technology is being introduced very quickly. Because while it is a full-blown fantasy environment, by the time you get to the end of it, enough time has passed, it's starting to resemble some elements of the Industrial Revolution, where like cannons are being introduced, and you're basically seeing old-fashioned like barbarians and Vikings with like dark magic going up against people that have slightly more modern warfare. And oftentimes that technology is being spearheaded by people who are practitioners of magic. There's a lot of interesting overlap. And Joe Abercrombie, I won't say he ends the series on a cliffhanger, but he definitely leaves it open-ended in case he ever wants to come back to it. But I think he wants to work on some other series for the time being as a palate cleanser. But if he ever comes back to the First Law series, I will absolutely be first in line to check out whatever comes next, because my favorite character is still alive and still very much active. But what else can I say about First Law? I'll say when it comes to the heroes, the absolute center of the 9 books, imagine the Battle of Gettysburg, but with a lot of like Vikings versus like kind of medieval Europe, where you've got so many bad motherfuckers and clashing all at the same time. But the way the book unfolds is from a variety of different points of view of people in this small town where the battle's taking place, as well as the points of view of some of the major figures on both sides. It's very reminiscent of the book The Killer Angels, about the Battle of Gettysburg from the Civil War. And I just, I had to like physically restrain myself from turning the pages too quickly. And there's been rumors out there that Rebecca Ferguson's working on an adaptation of Best Served Cold. I'm like, please don't make Best Served Cold without first adapting the first 3 books. But anyway, I hope Joe Abercrombie is getting a good payday. But for lovers of Clint Eastwood out there, if you ever want to know what if Clint Eastwood had been a big, scary Viking instead of a Western icon, well then Red Country has got your name on it. Imagine Unforgiven, but Unforgiven taken to a crazy extreme where you get that final scene from the movie kind of extended over hundreds of pages. I loved Red Country as well. You know what? To be honest, the Age of Madness trilogy, while I loved it and ripped right through it, might be my least favorite 3 books in the series. So maybe it was a good thing that Joe Abercrombie went off and started another series of books. But if you are a junkie for ongoing fantasy series, the First Law, it started in May of 2006 with The Blade itself, and there's also a collection of short stories called Sharp Ends, but it ran all the way through The Wisdom of Crowds in 2021. So over 15 years, he cranked out 9 books, and that's one of the things I love about Joe Abercrombie, is that he doesn't leave you hanging. He's prolific. He cranks books out, with great frequency and regularity, so you never have to wait long for whatever's coming next. So Joe Abercrombie, I've been having a blast over the last 10 years or so reading your books, and I hope you'll continue to write for many decades to come. But one day, somebody should turn some of his books into killer shows or killer movies. But now it's time to talk about one of my all-time favorite fantasy series, where I was guilty of mispronouncing the author's name for years, but I'm talking about what some people call the Prince of Nothing series, some people call the Second Apocalypse series, but it's written by R. Scott Baker, but I called him Backer for a long time. But do you hear the first 3 books in the series? His name's B-A-K-K-E-R. I was like, it looks like Backer, but anyway, it is Baker. But this series has niche appeal because it's so philosophical, but it's also at times so depraved that even where I feel like there's no darkness in fantasy that I'm not willing to eagerly devour, even I'm like, oh, dude, oh my God, like what is wrong with you? But there's no denying that he has created one of the most compelling fantasy worlds of anybody. And apparently it's like a lifelong journey for him, where he started out with tabletop RPGs, where he started fleshing out this world, and then he started writing the books. The sales have always been a little weak because the people who love this series obsess over it. And it's also one of those fantasy series where so precious little has been explained about its history that we kind of obsess over all the. I mean, I watch lore videos on this all the time, but there's just not a lot of lore to be explored. But the best way I can pitch it is this. Imagine a killer dark adult fantasy environment where at one point, a long time ago, a ship from either another universe or another plane of existence crashed into it, bringing all these unholy monstrosities into the world, which set off a series of horrible wars between the supernatural and human creatures that were already there. And eventually, the kind of the strange, it's either magic or technology or a mix of those two. But the techno, basically their hidden knowledge that the bad guys can employ allows them to bring about the creation of this creature called the No God, Mag-Faral, which brings about the first apocalypse. The first book starts right after the end of the first apocalypse and then flashes forward with all the characters and all the events that are going to lead up to the second apocalypse. And he's written 7 books, and he keeps threatening to write either 1, 2, or 3 more books to really wrap it up, because my only criticism of the series, one minor criticism, one major, I hate the last page of the 7th book so much. I'm like, I want to fucking kill you. But it's only because I loved what came before it so intensely that it would spark the kind of passion on my part. But I think he teaches classes, and he's interested in building houses. And the author Baker, he just I don't know if he'll ever find a publisher who wants to pay him what he is owed or what he is due in order to embark upon finishing the series. But it does more or less work as a complete story as is. It just doesn't end in a way where the readers are satisfied. No, that's not the ending that I was hoping for or that I wanted. But you could, if you want to, just read the first trilogy, the Prince of Nothing trilogy, which is fantastic, where you've got a total badass who comes from an obscure royal bloodline, coming out of obscurity and getting immersed in all the complex politics of that time. And his main goal is basically learning as much as he can about this world so that he can marshal all these forces and get prepared for his ordeal, his second ordeal, which is the focus of the quartet of books that comes after. But this is going to sound like heresy to say it. The greatest fantasy battles that I've ever read are featured front and center in the 7th book, The Unholy Consult. And I'm aware of the fact that J.R. Tolkien has written some great battles, and I'm aware of the fact that Steven Erikson has written some great battles. There are a lot of people out there who have written some pretty awe-inspiring battles. But what really sells these battles for me is there's a darkness and a horror ingredient that is unlike anything else I've ever experienced, where no other writer has ever, that I've read or that I've been exposed to, has plumbed the depths of horror to such a degree while at the same time telling big, badass, killer fantasy stories with, like, knights and wizards doing battle with dragons and that sort of thing. So R. Scott Baker, how dare you be as good, as talented as you are. I've read the initial trilogy twice, and the quartet that comes after, I read all of it once, and then I went back and reread all the parts that I liked for a second time, because my minor criticism of the quartet that follows is that it's uneven. It's got like these insane peaks and highs that are unlike anything I've ever experienced, and then it has a few side plots with characters that I'm just not that interested in. So when on my second read through, I just read the good stuff about the ordeal going up against the unholy consult, which leads to some of the most fucked up. I'll give you a taste of how depraved the battles become. There are these monsters called the Srank that are kind of like the orcs of this world, but they're much meaner and nastier and more grotesque, and these kind of gibbering monstrosities. But at a certain point, the ordeal that's going off to try to exterminate them once and for all, they're so overextended and they're so beyond their supply lines, they have no more food or resources, so they decide in order to keep the battle going or keep this ordeal going, they're going to start eating their enemies as a way of surviving, kind of living off the land as they proceed toward the area where they all come from. But as you eat the Srank, you start becoming like the Srank, and you start becoming more bloodthirsty and more carnivorous and more savage. And so you have descriptions of people like charging into battle, where once upon a time, they were always horrified of the Srank and kind of outnumbered and like running in terror. Now you have men buck-ass nude with like erections running into battle so they can eat more of the Srank. I mean, it is so depraved, so filthy, so disgusting. But if your taste in fantasy goes to the dark side, definitely check out all 7 of these books. Whether or not they could ever be turned into shows and movies is in the air. Maybe a really good studio in Japan could do a series of like really cool anime based on these books, and they could kind of, they could experiment with that first trilogy, and if it's more successful, they could go on from there. But I think every writer or director currently working in the Western Hemisphere, specifically Hollywood, would be too chicken shit to adapt these with any integrity. So they probably will be famously unadaptable for many years to come. But who knows, if we ever enter like a second renaissance in Hollywood where people start looking for darker, more perverse, more disturbing material, somebody might dust off the books of R. Scott Baker and adapt them properly. And while we're on the subject of writers who like to explore the darkness, let's talk about Robert E. Howard and his most famous creation, Conan. And I've got the complete Chronicles of Conan here, which collects all the short stories that he ever wrote. Robert E. Howard published a lot of Conan stories in Weird Tales while he was alive, and there were some stories that were published after the fact. I've not read every single one of them, but I've read several of them many times over because they're just that fucking good. And my favorite Conan stories, I've got a list of all the ones he wrote. Frost Giant's Daughter is fucking awesome. Scarlet Citadel is one of my all-time faves. The Tower of the Elephant is one of the most perfect fantasy stories ever written. Phoenix on the Sword is fucking great. I mean, there's so many good ones. And what's interesting, when you're reading Robert E. Howard, I like to read them in the order in which they were published. But even as he was publishing in them, he was jumping around throughout his lifetime. So sometimes it would be an elderly Conan, like ruling over his kingdoms. And sometimes it'd just be like a late teens who has like a loincloth and nothing else, just going on adventures and having all these strange experiences. Queen of the Black Coast. That's another one that's really fucking good as well, especially when you look at some of the the scandalous naked artwork by Steve Fabian, who did a great job of adapting some of the best scenes from Queen of the Black Coast. But the reason I mentioned Robert E. Howard as being one of the writers who kind of explored the dark side, he wasn't just writing great, big, epic, heroic fantasy like a lot of people assume. Sometimes Conan, some of his enemies that he encounters, and some of the adversaries that he faces, you almost feel like you're dipping into the world of H.P. Lovecraft and some of his stories. And that makes sense because Robert E. Howard was part of the circle of friends and collaborators of writers that kept up voluminous correspondence throughout the 1920s and 1930s, where so many of the best writers who were making a living by writing all this fiction for all these great magazines that were out there, they were just constantly in contact with one another, and oftentimes they would write stories that would contribute to whatever grand mythos those authors were creating. And Robert E. Howard did write stories to help flesh out the the Cthulhu mythos created by H.P. Lovecraft. In any case, what sets Robert E. Howard apart from other fantasy writers? First and foremost, bite-sized chunks. You don't have to make a big commitment. You can read little 20-page stories, which is always nice. But there's a philosophy at the core of it, and that philosophy is what sets Conan apart, where there are plenty of people who know how to tell like a story with a great plot. It's like a great yarn, and it takes you on an epic adventure. But what's so refreshing about Robert E. Howard's worldview is how he imbues Conan with a perspective on civilization, which is very, very critical. He's not that impressed by civilization because he often finds that people who come from the world of civilization say horrible things because they don't expect to have their head split open when they act in a rude fashion. And I feel like in 2026, we could use a little bit of that philosophy where people say a lot of horrible, unforgivable things because they assume that people aren't going to knock their fucking teeth out. And so, yeah, maybe we need Conan the Cimmerian to rise again. But I'm just relieved that I've still got a few more stories featuring the character to read. I also have never read any of the Kull the Conqueror stories written by Robert E. Howard. And Kull was the earlier character that he created. He wrote a bunch of short stories. And he also has all of his Solomon Kane stories, of which I've read just the first big one, which was fucking killer. It was cool. But I owe it to myself to read all of his Kull stories. But Conan was obviously turned into an amazing movie in 1982 by John Milius. And John Milius is one of those writers who could understand and appreciate Robert E. Howard's philosophy while also bringing in other ingredients from Russian movies like Alexander Nevsky. And he also could appreciate the Marvel comics by people like Roy Thomas. So luckily, there have been a few writers out there who've done some good Conan stories. And I hear that Robert Jordan's Conan stories are actually pretty good as well. I've never read any of those. But Robert E. Howard, he's one of the best ever to do it. Sadly took his own life at a very young age, but definitely pick up at least the first couple of Conan stories, take them for a spin, and just be prepared for an absolutely singular storytelling experience. But as far as future shows and movies are concerned, at one time, people were talking about doing a Conan show for Amazon, and Jennifer Salke, in her infinite wisdom, shot it down because she said he's too toxic of a character for the modern age. It's just one of many failings on Jennifer Salke's watch over at Amazon and Prime Video of those failings also include Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power. So thank God the show didn't get made on her watch, because she probably would have cut its fucking nuts off. But who knows? Maybe at some point we will see an ongoing show that adapts Robert E. Howard's stories in satisfying fashion. Now, it wouldn't be much of a video about the fantasy genre without dipping into the work of J.R.R. Tolkien, or Tolkien, as I've been calling him my whole life, just because of my accent. But Professor Tolkien, obviously, he's the granddaddy. He's the best ever to do it. And the Lord of the Rings has more or less been adapted in satisfying fashion. We got like the first book and a half done by Ralph Bakshi, and we got all 3 books done by Peter Jackson. And I don't know if anybody will ever make that attempt again, but that's probably as good as we're going to get when it comes to adapting the Lord of the Rings. And The Hobbit, we have a pretty good cartoon from the 1970s, as well as those 3 very silly movies featuring the character. But as far as the Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power is concerned, it is a complete and total abomination. It is a cancerous tumor on the penis of civilization. But I do review it just so that I have a complete understanding of all their failures. And also, people seem to enjoy watching me have all my temper tantrums. But basically, they're taking some of the appendices at the end of The Return of the King, which in broad strokes talks about some of the events of the Second Age, and they're trying to adapt it into a show without success. The Second Age could potentially be an incredible show, but it would require writers that are much more talented than they currently have. But also, to be fair, the Second Age is the period that Tolkien wrote about the least in the Silmarillion, which came out in 1977 after his death. His son, Christopher Tolkien, put it together. But there's basically like a 50, 60-page summary of the Second Age, which more or less is concerned with the forging of the Rings of Power and the fall of Numenor. But what has never been touched ever in any show or movie is the first age of J.R.R. Tolkien, which is like the first 2/3 of this book. And that first 2/3, eventually those stories were kind of fleshed out by Christopher Tolkien, where he took all the notes that his father ever wrote, and he more or less gave us the definitive editions of some of the stories contained within the first age. And the 3 big ones I want to bring up: The Children of Húrin, The Fall of Gondolin, and The Story of Beren and Luthien, all of which have been lovingly illustrated by Alan Lee, the best artist ever to be affiliated with the works of J.R.R. Tolkien. First read the Silmarillion, and initially, like, this is like almost like the Bible. Like the beginning is so bizarre, where it's kind of building this new mythology. But once things start to go dark, basically once Melkor, who eventually becomes to be known as Morgoth, steals the 3 Silmarils and retreats over to Middle-earth, and all these elves chase him over there, embarking upon this 1,000-year-long defeat, all these horrible wars. That's where it starts to get really good. And those are definitely the darkest stories that Tolkien ever wrote, especially the story of Turin Turambar, who is part of the Húrin family tree. But there are a lot of great heroes that come from Húrin's bloodline. But the reason I love The Fall of Gondolin so much, before I ever read the Silmarillion, I saw this killer painting by John Howe. I was like, wait a second. Once upon a time, there were like lots of dragons and lots of Balrogs participating in battles. Like, I need to read that at some point. And eventually, this is my first copy of the Silmarillion that I owned. I read it many times over. It's glorious stuff. But the first age, man, it probably needs, more than anything, what would be the best way to adapt it. Instead of a show or movie, just get great audio fiction with someone like Ian McKellen reading it, and then just having animation playing behind the words. That's probably the only way to really do it right. But if Amazon ever runs out of the energy and the money to make that horrible show, The Rings of Power, you never know. Maybe they'll tackle the first age at some point. Maybe it's going to take an entire generation of horrible filmmakers and writers in the world of film and television to die, and a new generation of great writers to come along before it can be done right. But yeah, of all the great unadapted fantasy series out there, all these books that came out recently could be adapted in incredible shows and movies. It would just take somebody with the taste and the integrity and the talent to place their abilities in service of Tolkien's vision and try to get it right. But that is that is the great unadapted story in the world of fantasy when it comes to film and television. So just as a way of wrapping up this video, I have a philosophical question for all you fantasy buffs out there. Does mythology count as the fantasy genre, or does that have more in common with folklore as opposed to fantasy? Because I feel like the fantasy genre, as we understand it, is more or less like a 20th century phenomenon. But obviously, people have been telling stories about King Arthur or Norse mythology or Greek mythology for centuries, if not millennia. And obviously, a lot of those ingredients have been borrowed by the fantasy genre and have helped inspire the fantasy genre. Obviously, J.R.R. Tolkien was obsessed with Norse mythology, and that inspired like the writers of Rohan and stuff like that. I don't know if mythology counts as fantasy or not, but if it does, somebody needs to adapt Neil Gaiman's Norse mythology. And I know Neil Gaiman right now is a little too hot to handle, and a lot of people consider him radioactive. What I've read is that he has been uncanceled. For people who are worried about cancellations, he has been uncanceled because he had some really disgusting, depraved sexual assault allegations that were hurled at him by some of the people who used to work for him. But apparently the charges have been dropped or thrown out. But anyway, everything's been dismissed. I don't know if his reputation will ever recover, but the reality is, between comic books like Sandman or books like Norse mythology, Neil Gaiman knows what he's doing when it comes to folklore, fantasy, horror, etc. And Norse mythology, I mean, I knew bits and pieces from reading Marvel comics and things like that as a kid, but I was kind of a blank slate when it came to the entire arc of Norse mythology. But what's great about his book is how he takes all the available stories out there and then just kind of assembles them in one place, and then just tries to tell them all in his own voice. Obviously, there have been a lot of people who have shared the stories of Norse mythology, but this is like Neil Gaiman's rendition of the stories of Odin and Loki and Thor and blah, blah, blah. It is so fucking entertaining, it'll make your head spin. I think I read it like in 2 days. I was like, I guess I'm just doing nothing but reading this book until it is finished. I just absolutely loved it. You could easily turn it into a killer animated series where you just adapt the book over a couple of seasons. So who knows? If Neil Gaiman's professional reputation ever makes a full recovery, we very well might be seeing his Norse mythology book being adapted, because I believe it is his best-selling book he ever wrote. And he even said at one point, if I had known what a success it was going to be, I would have written it much earlier. But yeah, that book, it's outstanding. And as long as we're discussing mythology, I should acknowledge Egyptian mythology remains one of my biggest blind spots. When I was a kid, the book Deities and Demigods, the D&D source book, had a bunch of kind of like short versions of some of the most famous stories and some of the major characters, and I eagerly read through that as a kid. But I've never found like a great book that adapts all the great Egyptian myths and legends. I need to read that at some point. But what I have read a lot of is Greek mythology. And I've got a lot of my college textbooks here, like a lot of Greek tragedies by people like Aeschylus and Sophocles and Euripides. And I've got Robert Graves, basically the entire Greek myths all in one volume. I've got Bullfinch's mythology, which is a lot of different kinds of mythology, all captured in one volume. But the big daddy, the doubleheader of the Iliad and the Odyssey, famously written written in quotes by Homer, whether it's the oral tradition or multiple authors, who really knows? I don't know if Homer was a singular person or a lot of people, but the stories have endured, and these adaptations were translated by Robert Fagles, which I definitely recommend. And if you want to get prepared for Christopher Nolan's upcoming movie, The Odyssey, the Ian McKellen audiobook is particularly good if you don't feel like reading the book itself. But here's what I'm going to pitch as what could be the greatest show or the greatest series of movies of all time. Because the Odyssey, you're kind of getting near the end of the story. But what someone should do is a series of movies that tackles all of Greek mythology. Start at the beginning with like the creation of the world, and then eventually like the Titans emerging and like the war with their children who become the Greek gods, then followed by all the early Greek heroes, many of whom are the children of Zeus. But I feel like people are always kind of dipping in and out, like, oh, we'll tell the story of Hercules, or we'll tell the story of Jason and the Argonauts, or we'll tell the story of Theseus. Like, no, tell the whole fucking thing. That would just, you could basically do 15, 20 seasons of TV, or you could do like 10 fucking movies in a row, and some of those characters would stick around for the entire franchise, like Zeus and people like that, and some people would only be around for a little bit. But if you wanted to just to adapt everything and then finish with the Odyssey, have a kind of bookend it, that would be so goddamn good. But speaking of the Odyssey, I've been watching a lot of Greek mythology movies in preparation for Nolan's movie. And it's funny, when you look at like the best Greek mythology movies ever made and the worst Greek mythology movies ever made, there's a lot of overlap, because most Greek mythology movies are pretty fucking terrible. Because a lot of them, like movies like The Immortals, will take a character like Theseus, throw his story over their shoulder, and like, we're just going to use the name and we're going to tell our own story. Like, no, fuck you. Tell the story of Theseus. Like, it's a killer story. So I don't know if anybody will ever have that undertaking, but imagine something with the scale and ambition and the budget of the MCU, but they just try to adapt every single Greek myth ever told, just like from Perseus to whomever. But later this year, as we get closer to the Odyssey, I will be doing a big video about the best and worst Greek mythology movies ever made. But I think with that, I'm ready to wrap up this video. Hope you enjoyed this little or this deep dive into the world of the fantasy genre. I'm very fired up for the remaining episode of A Night of the Seven Kingdoms, and I'll be cautiously optimistic about season 3 of House of the Dragon. Season 2 had a lot of warning signs, but had some good stuff too. So who knows what the future might bring. But for the time being, I'm feeling optimistic about the future. So that's why I felt compelled to make this video. But the next time we get a terrible show like Lord of the Rings, Rings of Power, or a terrible show like The Wheel of Time, which very poorly adapted Robert Jordan's books, or an even worse show like The Witcher, which adapted a few short stories by Sapkowski and then just decided to go off in this, kind of weird fever dream with a very different agenda. But every time a show like that comes along, I'm like, never touch anything that I like ever again. Leave my comics alone. Leave my video games alone. Leave my books alone. But A Night of the Seven Kingdoms, I'm like, you know what? Maybe I'm open to the possibilities of some of the stuff I like being adapted in the future. But let me know what you think down in the comments below. What great fantasy series did I not mention in this video that are worth reading and or adapting? I look forward to hearing your thoughts. But if you enjoyed this video, please remember to like, subscribe, hit that notification bell. I would greatly appreciate it. But more importantly, as always, onwards and upwards.